We are running out. But you know what? Choices matter, don't they? The choices we make define what happens next. For example, if you chose Cabin by the Lake over Disney World, you're going to choose very different actions, aren't you? Right? If you choose Cabin over Disney World, if you chose a cabin, here's what you're going to do. You're going to pack your car. You're going to make sure there's sleeping bags, probably some warm clothes, probably some wiener roasting sticks, some marshmallows, maybe some games to play for when it rains, right? But if you choose Disney World, you're going to make some different choices about what you're going to do. It's going to send you in a very different direction. You're going to end up going to a travel agent. You're going to end up booking airplane tickets. You're going to end up buying park tickets. You're going to end up packing a different type of clothes than you would if you're going to a cabin by the lake in the mountains, right? Choices really matter. In fact, the choices you make today determine what happens tomorrow. They define who you are tomorrow. This summer, we're looking through the book of Daniel. And we're looking at 7 different stories of Daniel and his friends. And when we think about Daniel, oftentimes we focus on one specific story. You know, there's one story that comes to mind. What is it? Daniel in the lion's den, right? I mean, this is a story we've heard countless times. This is a story we've probably told ourselves. And we focus on Daniel in the lion's den. Here's what you need to know. That story happens much later in Daniel's life, when he's an older person. And the Daniel in the lion's den, he is able to do what he does in that story because of a choice he made much earlier in his life. And that's where we're going to start, looking at a choice that a teenager made in Daniel chapter 1 that defined who the person was that ends up in a lion's den many, many years later. If you have your Bibles, turn with me to Daniel chapter 1, and let's look at this story of a teenager and the principle that it teaches us, that the decisions that we make, the choices we make today, define who we are tomorrow. And because of that, we need to make wise choices today. Daniel chapter 1 starts, and it says something interesting at the beginning. We're talking about the story of Daniel, but it doesn't actually start by talking about Daniel. The first 2 verses actually talk about the nation of Judah. Follow along at Daniel chapter 1 as I read this. It says, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. It starts off by setting the table about what's going on in Judah. Daniel lives in Judah at this point. And the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, comes and he surrounds the city of Jerusalem. And they attack and they overwhelm Jerusalem and they take off with a whole bunch of stuff from the temple of God. Why is this detail so important? Whenever we come across a detail, we need to ask ourselves, why is the author mentioning this? It's because what this is setting up is that for the people in Jerusalem and the people living outside of Jerusalem in Babylon or wherever they're living in the world, when a king came in and defeated a city or a nation and carried off the elements that are used to worship the God of the people that are defeated, it means that that king and that king's God has also defeated the God of the people of Jerusalem. And that sets the table for everything that's happened, is that Jerusalem, everyone in Babylon, believes that Yahweh, Daniel's God, is defeated. And it goes on and it says this. It says, then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of the court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hanani, Mishael, Azariah. The chief official gave them new names To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. To Hanai, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. So what's going on here? We have this conquering of Jerusalem, and then the king takes away a whole bunch of kids, a whole bunch of teenagers. You see, these teenagers are collateral. What the king is doing is he's saying to the people of Jerusalem and to all of Judah is that you better behave and you better do what I say, or your kids are gone. They are hostages. Daniel is led away as a hostage into Babylon. We don't know exactly how old he is, likely a teenager, like I said. Can you imagine what might happen if this were you? How you would feel in this moment? I remember when I was 11 years old, my parents moved my family from Hamilton, Ontario to Regina, Saskatchewan. We had grown up in Hamilton. That's where my parents were born. That's where my older sister and brother and myself were all born. That's where our grandparents and our cousins and everything that we knew was. And we moved here to Regina. And as an 11-year-old, I hated it. That first summer, I threatened so many times to get on my bike and to ride back to Hamilton. I know, not real threat. My mom was never concerned about it. Farthest I ever got was to my dad's work, which was about 10 blocks away. But that was what I was like. I hated it. In fact, that first year that we were in Regina, I cried more than I have ever cried in my life, because I was so disoriented by what was going on in my life. My orientation had been Hamilton, my family, everything that I knew was there. I was oriented in my life, and that was what was set. And I come to Regina, and I am completely disoriented. Have you ever moved? Have you ever been through a situation like that? Daniel, his whole world has been turned upside down. Not only has he been moved against his will, but actually, when he left his hometown, the opinion of the day was that Yahweh, his God, was gone, was defeated. And Daniel is in a complete situation where he is disoriented. His life was headed one way. He was orientated towards one course of living. And now everything is completely turned upside down, and he is completely disoriented. And you know what? There's a choice that we have to make when that happens. You see, you may not have moved like I did when I was 11 and been disoriented, but all of us know this feeling of disorientation right now. We know this feeling because the last several years have been very disoriented for us, haven't they? We thought we had life figured out. We thought we knew how things were going and where we were headed. I mean, maybe you are close to retirement and you thought 2022 is the year I'm going to retire, and then you looked at your stock portfolio and it's not so great. Or maybe in 2018, you were looking forward to being the class of 2020, and that didn't quite turn out like you thought. Or maybe there's something else going on in your life that has totally disoriented you. You thought you had life figured out. You thought you were on a good path. You thought everything was great. And now you are in this period of disorientation when you don't know what lies ahead, when you don't know what tomorrow looks like. And the choices you make in your disorientation matter. You see, when you're disoriented, you always have a choice to find a new orientation. And this is what Daniel has to choose. The king takes Daniel and his friends into his service in the kingdom, and he gives them new clothes, he gives them new food, he gives them new names. What is going on here? Well, what the king is trying to do is to give Daniel a new orientation in life. He's trying to turn him from a good Jew into a good Babylonian. That's why he gives him a new name. He says, your culture and everything about it is dead, and this is the new you, Belteshazzar. He gives him new food. Why is that significant? Because as Jews, they had a very specific dietary way of living. And the food that was given to Daniel, we're going to find out, is not the food that he was raised on, not the food that actually signified his relationship with his God. And the king is trying to deconstruct everything about Daniel's life and turn him into a good Babylonian. And Daniel has a choice. to choose a new orientation. He's in the middle of disorientation, and he has a choice to be oriented towards God or to be oriented towards King Nebuchadnezzar and this new way of living. What would you do if you were a teenager in that situation? How would you respond? Would you go along to get along, right? I mean, you're away from home, mom and dad are gone, you are on your own. And this king says, live this way, dress this way, eat this way, listen, this is your new name. Would you say, no, I'm Daniel? Or would you say, I'm Belteshazzar? What would you do? Grab your phone again and let's see what we would do. I want you to kind of answer it. This is anonymous, so it's very easy for you to just say, honestly, what would you do in Daniel's situation? The poll's open. Would you embrace your new surroundings? Or would you continue to live like you did back home? What would you do? What would you do? Think about it. I'm not going to show you the answers until everybody's voted. What would you do? We're kind of mixed, right? We're kind of mixed. It'd be easier to go along with what Nebuchadnezzar wants you to do. But we find out what Daniel does. You see, Daniel, in this moment of disorientation, he chooses to trust. To trust that even though the world says that God is defeated, that God is still there with him. There was a belief, actually, in the ancient Near East that, Yahweh existed and other gods existed within their boundaries, right? That Yahweh, Israel's God, was the God of Israel. And so here we have somebody who's transplanted hundreds of miles away from where he believes God resides, that God is in Jerusalem, that God is associated with his temple, and now he's somewhere else. And is God actually in Babylon? And what we find out through Daniel is God is there. And God is everywhere. But the ancients weren't sure. And so Daniel chooses to trust that even though he's not in Jerusalem near the temple, even though he's not surrounded by all the people that are like him, he chooses to trust God and choose a new orientation towards God. And it says in the next verse, it says, but Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. So the chief official gives them all sorts of great food. I mean, think about a king's table for a second. Think about your favorite foods, right? I mean, think about it being your birthday. What is it that mom and dad might cook for you on your birthday, right? What if your favorite foods were all on the table, what would they be? That's what a king's table is like. And Daniel decides that all of these amazing foods he's not going to eat. You see, the Jewish dietary restrictions weren't there just because they wanted to look good in a bathing suit. They were there because they symbolized the covenant that Israel had made with God. You see, a long time before Daniel came on the scene, God had created a covenant with his people, the Israelites. Now, covenant is a sacred promise that's made, a sacred promise that's only broken through death. It's kind of like getting married. When Britton and I got married, we stood on a stage kind of like this, and we stood before someone who looked a little bit like me, and we spoke vows to each other. We spoke vows that said, I will do this, and I will not do that. And Britton spoke that back to me. I will do this, and I will not do that. And the phrase we used at the end of it, maybe you know this phrase, till death do we part. That's a covenant. And see, God formed a covenant, like a marriage, with the people of Israel. And the things that he said he would do, Israel also had things that they said they would do. And one of those things was dietary restrictions. It was just a symbol, like the ring that Britain gave me, that shows that I'm part of a covenant. And the way that a Jew eats demonstrates that they are part of God's covenant relationship. And so Daniel, who is totally disoriented, totally on his own, what does he choose to do? He says, even though I'm somewhere else, even though I'm somewhere where nobody's looking over my shoulder to see if I'm eating bacon or not, right? He says, even though people are not looking over my shoulder, I'm still going to lean into relationship with God. You know, a lot of times we don't do that, right? We lean into relationship when somebody's watching or we think we'll get caught. But see, the choices we make in private determine who we'll be tomorrow. And Daniel chooses that trust that God is with him, and he chooses to lean into relationship by keeping on doing the things that define the covenant relationship that he had with God. And this is how Daniel becomes the guy who is in a lion's den someday. Because he chooses to lean in even when it doesn't make sense. He chooses to lean in even when the rest of the world says your God is dead. He chooses to lean in when things aren't going your way. There was a belief in the ancient world called the retribution principle. Do you know what this is? The retribution principle said that if I do enough good things, that God will do good things for me. And conversely, if I do enough bad things, at some point in my life, God is going to press the gotcha button, and bad things will happen to me. That's the retribution principle. The book of Job is all about the retribution principle and how that's not how God operates. But sometimes we still think that God operates that way. And you see, the people of Israel, they would have thought, we must have done something to deserve that. And in fact, they did do something. God kept warning them and warning them and warning them that someday things were going to happen. But that's not because God is waiting with a big gotcha button. It's because they chose to break their covenantal relationships. And when you choose to do things that break promises or break relationship, yeah, it's going to come back around. That's not God doing it to you. Sometimes we still think that the retribution principle applies today. We describe it different things, like they'll get what's coming to them someday. Anybody ever say that, right? That's the retribution principle. We call it karma. That's the retribution principle. That's not how God operates. God operates by grace and by love. And bad things happen, and we don't know why. And it disorientates us, like Daniel. And we have a choice. To trust and to lean into relationship, or think that God has something against us when things don't go as we expected. Friends, God doesn't sit up there waiting for you to do something wrong and say, finally, I'm giving it to them. And he doesn't wait up there saying, finally, they've completed enough good things. God is gracious and loving throughout all. And if we will lean into relationship like Daniel does, we discover this, that even in the place where we least expect God to be, like Babylon, that God is powerful and present. And if we lean into relationship, we discover something amazing, that he's there with us. Daniel discovers this. He chooses not to defile himself. He chooses to trust God, and he chooses to lean into relationship. And it says in verse 9, now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. So God shows favor to Daniel as he leans into relationship, right? As he follows God, he discovers that God has actually caused this person, before Daniel ever chose, to actually have favor towards him. The guard's a little concerned, though, because he's kind of got my attitude that vegetables aren't good for you and that no one ever made friends with salad. It's just true. The guard is concerned, and Daniel says to the guard, who had been appointed over his friends, he says, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink, and then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. And so the guard, who wasn't sure this was going to work, agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. And so the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all the kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. Here's what you need to know. It's not because of the diet that Daniel becomes wise. It's not because of the diet that Daniel can interpret dreams and visions, as you're going to see in the weeks ahead. It's not because of the diet that Daniel can be in a lion's den and not get eating. You know, a vegetarian will still get eaten by lions, believe me. It's not because of the diet. It's because of the practices. It's because when Daniel was disoriented, he chose to trust God. He chose to lean into relationship. That makes all the difference in Daniel's life, not the diet. You can go on the Daniel diet plan, but if you're not leaning into relationship with God, it will make no difference at all. You could be a vegetarian or a meat eater, and if you are ignoring God, you're not going to have a relationship with him, right? Isn't that how relationships work? It's not about what you eat. It's about the relationship, who you eat with, right? And Daniel learns that. And Daniel leans into the practices that he learned growing up of how to cultivate a relationship with God, even when no one's looking or watching, even when he's not accountable. He says, I know that these things will draw me closer to God, and so I will lean in. And too often when we find ourselves in Daniel's situation, when we're experiencing disorientation, we lean out and we give up practices that actually would be helpful to us in the midst of our disorientation. We stop coming to places like this. We stop listening to what God has to say through prayer. We stop listening to what God has to say through Scripture. We stop gathering with people who are like-minded and who can help us process the hurts and the pains in our life. We go inward instead of looking for people to help us. There's a lot of practices that we tend to give up when life gets tough. And they're exactly the practices that will lead us deeper into relationship with God. Daniel, when life got tough, when life didn't make sense, leaned into relationship. And the practices he followed changed him. Daniel's changed by relationship with God, not by the food that he eats. The food that he eats is just proof that he's leaning in. Tell me, what's the proof in your life that you're leaning in to relationship with God instead of leaning out? I want you to grab your phone again. And this one may be a question more for mom and dad than it is for the kids, but let's see what we can do. Here's what I want you to do. What do you do to grow in your relationship with God? That's the question I want you to answer, and it's going to show up there. Whatever it is you say, but it's anonymous. What are some of the things you do? How do you show that you are leaning into relationship with God? Maybe you are here today and you've been leaning out. And maybe what you need to do is read the screen and discover some of the practices that are up there and begin to embrace those practices. Maybe it's becoming a vegetarian. I don't know. We'll see. How do you lean in? Lots of great ways there. What do you need to do to lean into relationship today? Well, Daniel goes through all of this, Daniel and his friends. And it says, at the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar, and the king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel and his friends. And so they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all his magicians and enchanters in the whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. Daniel chooses to trust that God is present even when it doesn't look like it. Daniel chooses to lean in his practices, the way that what he's doing in life gives evidence of that. And Daniel chooses to continue to live in this kingdom for the rest of his life. But he chooses to be different than the kingdom. And this is what makes all the difference. Talks about the king Nebuchadnezzar, and Daniel becomes close to him. And you're going to hear the story of what happens with Nebuchadnezzar in the weeks ahead. But what happens in the nation of Babylon, because Daniel chooses to be different, chooses to live differently than everybody else around him, that actually the nation of Babylon is changed. The nation of Babylon thought they had conquered Yahweh and taken all of his possessions and taken his people, and that their God was victorious. But what we find out is actually Daniel and his friends change a nation because they choose to be different. They choose to trust God even when the rest of the world said God is dead. They choose to lean into relationship by doing things that the rest of the world said, that's crazy. Why would you ever do that? And they live differently, and a nation is changed. King Nebuchadnezzar is changed, and the kings that follow are impacted. And if you know the arc of the narrative of the Scripture, you know that the Israelites actually return. There's a remnant that returns to Jerusalem, and they rebuild the wall that was destroyed. They rebuild the temple that was destroyed. And Daniel, who is in a position of power for his life in Babylon, I think that Daniel and some of his friends, in their own way, were able to influence the direction that allows Jerusalem to be rebuilt and Israel to return. You could be a Daniel today. You see, we're all living in a world that is very different than the place that God created for us. And we have an opportunity to trust God when we're disoriented. We have an opportunity to lean into relationship when it doesn't make sense. We have a choice to be different. You see that this whole orientation and disorientation, it all leads to a new orientation in life. And as we choose to trust God and lean in and to be different, we discover a new orientation that leads us closer in relationship with God, but also helps other people to discover a new orientation as well, an orientation towards God. And there's going to be lots of time in your life where you're going to be kind of like Daniel, where it feels like life is turned upside down and you're disoriented and you have to choose, will I trust and lean in and receive a new orientation that takes me closer to God, or will I choose to follow myself or someone else and move away from God? There were other people besides Daniel and his few friends that were taken off into captivity. They didn't make the choice that Daniel did. And today we have that same choice. Will we be like Daniel, or will we be like some of the other people that aren't named? It wasn't that the king only took 4 people or 5 people into captivity. We have a choice. How will we live in our Babylon today? That's what this series is all about. So tell me, what do you need to do in response? You know, maybe today you're in a situation and you're feeling completely disoriented. I mean, all of us here in this room have been disoriented for the last 3 years, basically. And we have a choice to trust God or not. And maybe today you have to just make that choice that I'm going to trust God in the midst of whatever's going on in my situation. Maybe you need to lean in. Maybe you need to lean in by embracing some practices that are different. Maybe the practices you've been doing aren't leading you closer to God, but you saw something on the screen that you want to try and you want to explore what that looks like. Lean in to relationship. Don't lean out. Or maybe you need to just choose to be different in your Babylon, whether that is the public sector, whether that is private business, whether that be school, whether that be wherever, your community, your family. And maybe you need to choose to be a Daniel today. The Daniel of the lion's den begins as the teenager, as he trusts, leans in, and makes those choices again and again and again throughout his life. What do you need to do? Here's what we're going to do. We're going to stop for a second, take just a minute or two to give you a chance to think about that. And I'm going to invite you to take out your phone again and to put up there how you're going to respond. What will you do in response? You don't have to put your name, but just put it up there. Here's what I'm going to do because of what I heard today. Maybe the Spirit's been speaking to you about something. Maybe it's not the application that I put forward to you. Maybe it's something else. Just put it up there. We're going to take a minute or two to do that. And then we're going to move into a time of communion. What do you need to do in response? I'm going to invite the band to come out while you're thinking about that, and to invite those that are serving communion to come to the front as well.